All right, let's jump into this deep dive. We're tackling Thomas Carlyle's latter-day pamphlets, specifically looking at excerpts from the 1850s.
Right.
This was a time of massive change, huge disruption in Europe, right after the 1848 revolutions, and Carlyle is taking this incredibly sharp look at society, at government, and, well, at what he sees as its really deep failures. Our mission in this deep dive is to really pull out the core arguments, the surprising insights, the things that make you sit up and pay attention from this text.
Yeah.
So you can get a handle on Carlyle's intense critique of his era. And honestly, maybe see if any of it resonates today. He is absolutely not shy about his opinions, and the language is something else.
That's absolutely right. Carlyle isn't writing some detached analysis here. This is passionate, almost furious, really. A response to the world he saw crumbling around him. He genuinely believed society was in a state of crisis. So as we go through these sources you've provided, we'll focus on understanding what he saw as the problems and why he felt such urgency. What important nuggets can we, dig up from this very specific perspective?
Okay, let's start with that atmosphere he describes. He paints a picture of a time that sounds incredibly dramatic, almost, well, apocalyptic.
He uses really vivid, almost Gothic language to set the scene. He calls it the 12th hour of the night.
Wow.
He says things like birds of darkness are on the wing, specters uproar, the dead walk, the living dream. It's really meant to convey a sense of profound disarray, a world just teetering on the edge.
So he feels like the old way of doing things is just completely finished, kaput.
Precisely. He sees a necessary new era that has to come, but he warns that without a universal new birth, the alternative is universal ruin, that old sorry routine people were used to. He's convinced it's completely unsustainable. Everything feels like it's collapsing.
And this feeling is directly tied to the actual history happening right then, right? The sources mention the events of 1848 specifically.
Yes, absolutely. He's writing immediately after those widespread revolutions in 1848, what he calls the March Days. He mentions Italy, France, Prussia, Austria, saying the upheaval went from end to end of Europe, kings were overthrown, and he saw it leading to what he calls open kinglessness, what we call anarchy.
Anarchy. And things like the Pope's initial reforms or the Sicilian insurrection, they kind of kicked things off, especially in France.
He sees those as definitely contributing factors, yeah, a spark. France, for him, is the city of insurrections. He notes how the French saw themselves as the chosen soldiers of liberty. He points out that even the good, simple Pope, with his New Testament, had a role, even if maybe the scale of the explosion wasn't fully anticipated.
And how does he describe what happens right after in France?
Oh, he's quite dismissive. He sees it as a weltering mob presided over by Monsieur de Lamartine at the Hôtel de Ville.
Right.
And he contrasts how Lamartine was seen by some as, like, a prophet, with how his wise Yankee friends simply described him as a literary gentleman.
You can really hear the scorn there, can't you? Leadership based just on words.
Exactly.
Okay, so that gives us the dramatic backdrop. A world in crisis, old systems failing. What does Carlyle see as the fundamental, the underlying problem with society at this moment? What's his core diagnosis?
This is where he introduces his central concept, a bankruptcy of imposture. That's the brief definition he gives for the state of things. Everything, he argues, is built on falsity, on lies, basically.
Bankruptcy of imposture. Okay, what does he mean by imposture? Like fakeness?
Yeah, fakeness, shams, that's his word. He talks about decent forms long since fallen empty of meaning, and plausible modes, solemnities grown ceremonial. These are the outward appearances, the rituals, the ways of doing things that look respectable but have lost all their substance, their reality.
And he contrasts this with someone who's perfectly comfortable with these shams. The solid Englishman wholesomely digesting his pudding.
Right, that guy. The solid Englishman, among what are called the cultivated classes. This type isn't bothered by the shams because, from their viewpoint, things seem to be working, at least economically. He imagines them thinking, did not cotton spin itself, beef grow quite comfortably by the side of shams? Lawyers did their thing, bishops preached, money was being made, bankers paid out. On the surface, it all looked fine.
There's that really cynical line in the source, too, about someone trying to actually fix it.
Oh, yeah. The greatest sham, I have always thought, is he that would destroy shams. It perfectly captures that resistance, that pushback against challenging the comfortable lies.
But Carlyle believes this widespread falsity, it just can't last. It has to break down.
Absolutely. He sees this universal reliance on shams as inevitably collapsing because, as he puts it, it's contrary to nature. Nature, reality, he argues, ultimately knows the truth, even if people manage to convince themselves otherwise for a while.
Okay, so society is built on these empty forms, these shams, and it's starting to fall apart. Where does he aim his sharpest criticism when he looks at government and politics? What's his big target there?
Well, a major target for Carlyle is democracy, particularly universal suffrage. He is profoundly skeptical, to put it mildly.
And he uses that great analogy, the one involving a ship, to explain why.
Yes, it's very clear, isn't it? He says, unanimity on board ship. If the tack they unanimously steer upon is guiding them into the belly of the abyss, it will not profit them much.
Right. Getting everyone to agree doesn't help if you're all agreeing to sail into disaster.
Exactly. He points out that on a real ship, you don't vote on which way to go, and you certainly don't accept phantasm species of captains. Captains who aren't genuinely capable, who don't actually know what they're doing.
So the ballot box isn't enough. Not if the leadership isn't real, isn't competent.
That's his argument. The ballot box is excellent for keeping the ship's crew at peace under their phantasm captain, but unserviceable under such for getting round Cape Horn. It might maintain a kind of superficial calm, but it won't actually navigate the ship through real dangers, real challenges.
He makes a pretty bold historical claim about democracy too, doesn't he?
He does. He asserts that he doesn't believe there was no nation that could subsist upon democracy. He brings up ancient republics and points out that 3 of the famous 7 sages were actually tyrants, strong, decisive rulers, suggesting that capable leadership wasn't historically democratic in his view.
And there's that memorable, rather harsh quote from his wise Yankee friend about America.
Oh, that one, yeah. The friend's very cynical take on America's achievement. They've doubled their population and produced 18 millions of the greatest bores ever seen in this world before.
Ouch. Harsh. So for Carlyle, the American example isn't really a model for England.
No, he specifically cautions against predicting the success of democracy on the English side of the Atlantic based on America's experience. And this whole critique of democracy, it's tightly linked to his idea of no government.
No government?
Or what he calls constituted anarchy.
Which sounds like the absolute opposite of what's needed in a crisis.
It is. He describes it as the choking, sweltering, deadly, and killing rule of no rule. It's the state where there's no genuine leadership, no real direction, and as a result, chaos and incompetence just take over.
Okay, so we have this diagnosis, bankruptcy of imposture. Then the critique of talk-based leadership and democracy leading to this constituted anarchy. What are the actual practical consequences of this leave-alone principle, this lack of real government action that he points to in the sources?
He gives some really concrete examples, things that show the suffering it causes. The shirt-making example is quite powerful.
Yeah, tell us about that.
Shirts by the 30,000 are made at 2 pence halfpenny each, and in the meanwhile, no needlewoman can be procured. He uses this to show how this no government beautiful and human business, as he sarcastically calls it, has completely failed to organize labor effectively.
Leading to this paradox.
Exactly. You have both horrible exploitation, people working for almost nothing, and at the same time, a shortage of workers for needed tasks. It's completely dysfunctional.
So the idea that the market left alone will just magically sort everything out, he's saying it leads to this kind of mess.
Precisely. It creates exploitation and these bizarre imbalances. He lists other results, too. British liberty, he says ironically, means people aren't even taught to read properly. Millions are spent feeding people who are idle, but the state dare not employ them productively.
Right.
People are forced to live over poisonous cesspools with no effective action to improve basic living conditions.
And he sees this kind of failure extending beyond England, to Ireland and the West Indies as well.
Yes. He points to White Ireland, with its famishing inability to find any work, and the workhouses that are just rapidly bursting because they're overwhelmed, and the Black West Indies with what he controversially calls their lazy refusal to work. He views both situations as direct consequences of this failed principle of just leaving things alone, of not providing real governance.
And the conclusion he draws from all these different examples, what's the takeaway?
He concludes, not emancipation, it would seem, not the cutting loose of human ties, something far the reverse of that. He's arguing that more undirected freedom or just severing connections and responsibilities isn't the answer. It's actually something that reestablishes proper ties, order, and direction.
Okay. Beyond the economic and social dysfunction, Carlyle also reserves some of his most scathing language for the modern philanthropic movement of his time.
Oh, yes. This section is particularly biting. He is incredibly critical of what he perceives as misguided or maybe just ineffective charity.
The sources describe his visit to a prison, right? A model prison.
He details visiting an exemplary or model kind of London prison. He talks about how incredibly clean and well-maintained it is. He says something like, probably no duke in England lives in a mansion of such perfect and thorough cleanness. He notes the excellent food, the schools, the teachers provided for the prisoners, whom he rather bluntly labels the devil's regiments of the line.
And his outrage comes from comparing this
Yeah.
this prison palace to the world outside.
Exactly. That's the core of it. He contrasts the almost luxurious, certainly clean and ordered environment for convicted criminals with the continents of dingy, poor, and dirty dwellings surrounding the prison, where ordinary people are struggling and, as he puts it, have not yet quite declared for the devil.
His reaction to the treatment of prisoners is pretty intense then.
It's visceral. He just rails against feeding them in palaces, hiring the choicest spiritual and material artificers to expend their industries on you. He cries out, "No, by the eternal." His point is that benevolence, resources, effort should be directed towards the struggling, honest poor in those dingy caverns, not primarily lavished on convicted criminals.
He describes this kind of philanthropy as, what was it, blind, loquacious pruriency. That's quite a phrase.
It is. He sees it as this sort of talkative, indiscriminate urge to do good that has somehow replaced a genuine, divinely awful sense of right and wrong. He believes true reform and an end to misery require actually getting rid of folly, getting rid of wickedness, not just applying charity and rosewater over the top.
And this connects to a really strong, maybe controversial statement he makes about justice and hating scoundrels.
Yes, it's definitely one of his more challenging points for a modern reader, I think. He argues that just hatred of scoundrels and not love for them and incessant whitewashing must be the backbone of any human religion whatsoever.
Wow. Backbone of religion.
He feels that the universe itself has natural consequences for those who fundamentally act against its order, against reality and rightness. He states there's one valid reason, and only one, for either punishing a man or rewarding him. That nature has said of the man, he is not permitted to live here. Essentially, if your actions are completely out of step with reality and morality, you forfeit your place.
That's a very stark perspective on justice.
Yeah.
He also turns his critical eye to the actual machinery of government, the offices like Downing Street, the bureaucracy.
Yes, he shifts focus to the practical day-to-day administration, and he finds it severely wanting. He highlights the widespread complaint against what he calls red tape establishments, places like the Colonial Office or Foreign Office. The universal feeling, he reports, is one of facing blind obstructions, fatal indolences, pedantries, stupidities, a worldwide jungle of red tape.
And he uses another classic analogy for this problem, doesn't he?
He does. The stable of King Augeas, remember that story? The stables hadn't been cleaned in ages and were piled high with, well, mountains of dung.
Right. Needs a Hercules.
Exactly. He suggests you need a Hercules figure. He mentions Sir Robert Peel, perhaps, to come in and clear out these accumulated dung mountains of inefficiency, delay, and accumulated falsehood within the government offices.
What are the specific problems he identifies within these offices? What's going wrong?
He sees two main issues, really. First, the work that does need doing is ill done. It's delayed, it's neglected, it's put in the hands of people who just aren't capable.
Okay.
Second, and maybe even worse in his view, much of the work being done should never have been managed at all by those central offices. It belongs elsewhere, for example. He strongly felt the colonies should be managing much more of their own affairs, not having everything dictated from London.
And he blames this mess on what? What's the root cause?
Fundamentally, insufficient intellect. He calls it a sad insufficiency, particularly a specific kind, pedant darkness, which asserts and believes itself to be light. It's not just a lack of raw intelligence, but a kind of narrow, rule-bound academic mindset that thinks it knows best but is actually completely blind to practical reality.
That quote about the stupid subaltern really drives that point home.
It's a really damning observation, isn't it? A stupid subaltern will do as well as a gifted one. The essential point is that he be a quiet one and do not bother me. It describes a system that prioritizes conformity and not rocking the boat over actual competence and initiative.
And he feels even major political changes, like the Reform Bill, didn't fundamentally fix this.
No, he argues the same kind of men essentially stayed in power, just maybe shifting their allegiances, formerly obedient to the old Tory ways, now obedient to Whig ideas, and crucially, to popular opinion or parliamentary talk. They are respectably commonplace in facility, he says, while the massive challenges the country faces demand people who are far more capable, far more insightful.
So bad governance, ineffective bureaucracy. Another really big target for Carlyle, maybe one of his most famous, is the emphasis on eloquent speech, what he dismissively calls the stump orator.
Oh, this is a constant theme, runs right through the pamphlets. He absolutely laments the situation where you have the talker established in the place of honor and the doer hidden in the obscure crowd.
He sees rhetoric, the ability to speak well, being valued above actual work or capability.
Absolutely. He finds it just astonishing that the proof of excellence is to be done by the tongue, this idea that all is attainable if you can talk with due ability. He just doesn't buy it.
And he contrasts this with how things used to be, or how he imagines they used to be.
Yes, he suggests that historically, education, learning a trade, becoming capable, was through practical apprenticeship. He says priests needed something to speak, actual truth, real wisdom, rather than just mastering the art of speech itself. The focus, he argues, was on substance, not just presentation or smooth talk.
And what does he think of this modern elevation of talk, disunited from facts?
He calls eloquent talk, disunited from nature and her facts, a truly astonishing product. He sees it as potentially the saddest of all the curses that now lie heavy on us, acting as a chief destroyer of good because it masks emptiness, it distracts from reality, and it prevents real effective work from being done.
He connects it directly to falsity, to lying.
He does. He says a lying thought inevitably comes from a loose tongue, and that this kind of talk creates a false mirror of this universe. Talk becomes a substitute for reality, a dangerous distortion.
And for political leaders, this reliance on talk is particularly bad.
He sees it as a fatalist misery that for a British man to become a statesman, a chief of workers, he first has to prove himself a chief of talkers.
Yeah.
He asks, rhetorically, if there could possibly be a falsest and unfairest way to test someone's ability to do things than just based on their ability to talk about them.
The Robert Burns example he uses is a pretty sad illustration of that point, isn't it?
It is. He calls Burns a born king of men, someone full of intellect and genuine worth, but says he had no chance to get into Parliament because he wasn't a talker in the specific way the political system demanded. He couldn't play that game.
So according to Carlyle, if you have real intellect, real capability, what are your options?
His harsh summary is you basically have two paths. You must either make it into beaverism, which means using your intellect purely to gather money, become industrious in a narrow, wealth-accumulating way, or else make talk with it, using your intellect to become an eloquent speaker and gather what you can from that influence position, whatever talk brings. Real doing gets lost.
Wow. Okay, given this pretty devastating critique of the present, the shams, the anarchy, the red tape, the rule of talk, what does Carlyle actually propose as the way forward? What's the solution, if he has one?
Well, he argues that the true ultimate goal of any real reform, all that democracy ever meant in its best aspirations, is actually the attainment of a truer and truer aristocracy, or government, again, by the best.
By the best. An aristocracy of merit, not birth. But he doesn't think the current system, with elected parliaments, can find these best people.
No, he's quite firm on that. He says parliaments have lamentably failed, and will and must forever fail, to achieve this just through elections alone. The solution for him is finding and empowering the noblest, the ablest men. These people are, as he puts it, eternally elected by the Maker himself. They're chosen by nature, by reality, not through ballot boxes or popular clamor.
So England needs to somehow find these truly capable people, these natural leaders.
He believes such kings, these capable individuals, still exist in England, but they're likely among the silent. They're the ones doing real work through silent facts and modest, valiant actions, not making noise in Parliament. The country needs to summon out its kings.
And how would you actually do that? How would you find these people and put them in power? Sounds difficult.
He suggests the need for a figure like a reform premier, a kind of true king, temporary king, a leader with real insight, with eyes in his head. This leader would have the incredibly important task of choosing the fittest men from the entire nation, from all the 27 millions, selecting them based on their actual intellect and nobleness, their proven ability, not just their connections or their skill at talking.
So intellect, real capability, is the absolute key quality for leadership in his eyes.
He states it very clearly. Intellect is the real object of reverence. It's the exact summary of human worth. That's what should be valued above all else in leaders.
And finding these men is far more important, far more effective than things like extending who gets to vote.
Infinitely better, he argues. Extending suffrage might just result in a Noah's deluge of parliamentary eloquence. More talk, not better action. He holds out the hope, perhaps optimistically, that just one such truly capable man in a key position, like running things from Downing Street, could effect there more for us in 10 years than the best conceivable reformed parliament in twice or 10 times 10.
So the absolute vital necessity, the core task, is getting able and abler men into positions of real power.
For Carlyle, that is the absolute heart of his proposed solution to the nation's deep problems. Everything else flows from that.
Okay, let's connect this back to those practical problems he was so angry about earlier, like the idle laborers, the unemployment, the shirt-making situation. How does his idea of finding these able leaders address those issues directly?
This leads directly to what he calls the organization of labor. He sees the huge problem of the unemployed, the desperate poor, the outcast captainless soldiers, the Hodges emancipated horses, as he graphically calls them, as the universal vital problem of the world. It has to be tackled.
You need direction, they need purpose, they need leadership.
They must be put under due captaincy, he insists. Otherwise, they inevitably become banditti street barricaders. It's not just about finding them work, it's a fundamental necessity for social stability and order. Unled masses are dangerous.
He mentions industrial regiments. What does he mean by that?
Yes, he suggests the idea of forming industrial regiments, almost like armies, but not for war between nations. Their purpose would be to fight against bogs and wildernesses at home and abroad, and to chain the devils of the pit.
Meaning
Fighting against unproductive land, against poverty, against ignorance, against all the practical problems that need solving through organized, disciplined work. Tackling the real enemies of human well-being.
And this is where he has a massive disagreement with the economists of his day, the ones he calls the professors of the dismal science.
Absolutely. He argues very strongly against the political economists who, in his view, focus only on the laws of the shop till, on supply and demand, and the abstract principles of free markets. He declares famously that the universe is not wholly a shop. Their way of thinking, he believes, has reached the end of its tether and simply cannot solve the real, deep human problems.
So he sees pauperism, the state of being poor and idle and unable to find work, not just as an economic issue then. It's something deeper.
Oh, much deeper. For him, it's a profound symptom of the whole system being broken. It's the general leakage through every joint of the ship that it is rotten. It's a visible sign of failure. He calls it a scandalous poison tank sitting at the heart of society. He's quite blunt about it. The quagmire must be drained or we cannot live. It's an existential threat.
And where does he think you start draining that massive quagmire? Where's the starting point?
He identifies pauperism itself as the crucial starting point for any meaningful reform. This of pauperism is the corner where we must begin, the main drain that needs to be cleared first to even hope to clean up the whole Stygian swamp of societal problems.
Okay.
And he links this task directly back to the lack of true leadership. If true captaincy and true teachership actually existed and were effective, he implies, pauperism wouldn't be such a massive, intractable problem.
And he envisions this organized, regimented approach eventually extending beyond just the unemployed or those working on wasteland.
Yes, he suggests this kind of organizing principle, this idea of work being properly led and directed by capable individuals, could eventually apply to all industries, making cloth, making shoes, everything, moving society towards what he calls a governed commonwealth.
That's a pretty radical vision for organizing society, very top-down.
Yeah.
What does he see as the fundamental, the essential function of the state in all of this? What's its real job?
He argues that the true purpose of the state, the reason government offices like the Home Office should exist, a purpose he feels has been largely forgotten amid all the bureaucracy and political noise, is simply this, that life and work may continue possible and may not become impossible for British men.
Just enabling people to live and work productively. Contrasting that with all the sort of pointless debates and activities he sees government engaging in.
Exactly. He dismisses things like Parliament debating obscure theological points like prevenient grace or worrying about the color of the bishop's nightmare as just part of the accumulated dung and falsity. The real necessary business of government is much more fundamental, enabling people to live decent lives and do meaningful work.
And the biggest thing the state needs to do to actually fulfill that essential function.
The absolute want of wants, he repeats, is finding men able to command men in ways of industrial and moral well-doing, locating these capable leaders, these true commanders of work and life, and empowering them that, for Carlyle, is the only path heavenward, the only way to real national progress.
He also touches briefly on other areas where the state is failing because of this lack of true leadership, doesn't he? Beyond just domestic issues.
Yes, he mentions colonial administration, again, stressing the need for truly wise governors, not just administrators, and expressing shame at the idea of potentially letting colonies go simply because managing them properly seems too costly or difficult. He also calls for a proper minister of education, someone who can steer the nation's learning towards a divine goal, towards wisdom and truth, not just fill heads with facts or rhetoric.
Bringing it all together, then, it really sounds like a constant driving theme for Carlyle is this fundamental battle between truth and reality on one side and all the shams, the illusions, the empty talk on the other.
It's absolutely fundamental to his entire critique, yes. He keeps returning again and again to the idea that nature or reality knows well that it is a lie. Even if people manage to build whole systems and societies based on falsehoods, reality always knows.
And nature keeps score, so to speak. There are consequences.
He has that really powerful image of nature's most exact savings bank. It rigorously records every single act of veracity and heroism, every moment of truth and courage, but it also records every loud, blustery blunder, every lie, every act of incompetence. And these accounts, he insists, are eventually settled rigorously as fate. The payment isn't just in money either.
So what are the ultimate consequences for those who deal in shams, the politicians who are just stump orators, and the nations that follow them?
Well, for the stump orator and the nations that foolishly follow them, he says they effectively partner with the universe of phantasm. They're dealing in forged notes, counterfeit reality. Their ultimate fate, in his dramatic language, is facing patibulary forks and prisons of death everlasting.
Which is a really stark, intense way of saying.
Of saying that ultimately reality will catch up. Falsehood, incompetence, systems built on lies, they are doomed to fail, often catastrophically.
Contrasted with nature's fundamental, unchanging laws.
Exactly. Those eternal laws are inflexible of nature. They continue to obey their own law, not our law, deaf as the granite mountains. You can ignore them, you can try to talk around them, you can pass laws contrary to them, but in the end, they will have the final say. Reality bats last.
Wow. That was definitely a deep dive into some incredibly strong, passionate opinions. Thomas Carlyle, in his latter-day pamphlets, really does not pull any punches, does he?
He really doesn't, not at all. We've seen his powerful, often furious critique of a society he genuinely felt was collapsing under the weight of its own fakeness, its shams, led by talkers and ineffective bureaucrats instead of truly capable people, treating, in his view, criminals better than the hardworking poor, and completely failing at the essential task of organizing labor and society effectively.
Yeah, his call for rule by the ablest men, regardless of how they get there, found somehow beyond elections, and his fierce rejection of bureaucracy and empty rhetoric. It certainly gives you a lot to wrestle with, doesn't it? He saw his time as this profound moment of crisis that demanded a radical return to truth, to reality, and to genuinely capable leadership.
It's a challenging text, no doubt, full of incredibly strong, sometimes uncomfortable language. But it offers some very sharp observations about that potential disconnect between appearance and reality, between talk and action, and the potential consequences of inaction and incompetence in leadership, especially in times of crisis.
Thinking about this text, here's maybe a final thought, a question for you listening. Carlyle makes this very sharp, very clear distinction between eloquent talk and meaningful action, between what he calls phantasm captains and true leaders who are grounded in reality. So, how do you discern, maybe in your own life or just in the world around you today, who are the talkers dealing in those forged notes and who are the doers actually grounded in nature's fact? Something to think about.